I'm Steve Perry. This is Biblical Anarchy. And today, we are flogging a dead horse. What am I talking about? I'm back on Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because today is Saturday, which means yesterday is Friday, at least last I checked. And Pastor Mike Winger uploaded a video on Sodom and Gomorrah on his 20 questions. And I got into a discussion with him on it. And I decided to do this video real quick just to approach where I believe he's wrong. He, of course, thinks it's about homosexuality, the standard Christian view. I argue it's about humans and angels cohabitating, let's say. Obviously, if you're a young person, if you have young people in the room, this is going to get a little graphic because of the nature of the discussion. You might want to usher them out. That warning aside, I want to start out by addressing what Pastor Mike says near the end, because I want to applaud him for this. What he says when he's discussing the book of Jude is he says, you can disagree with Jude. That's okay. But what you can't do is force Jude to agree with you. And I agree with him 100% on that, okay? I disagree with Jude. I disagree with Jude. I can't force Jude to agree with me. Jude doesn't agree with me. So I'm stuck disagreeing with him. That's all I can do. But I'm not going to twist what he says to make him match my views like I believe Pastor Mike is doing. So, I also disagree with Pastor Mike, just for the record, that this is about homosexuality. I've never, for all the videos I've done on the topic, and there's several of them, I've never addressed it. I have done a long video on this topic where I'm responding to a sermon by Dr. James White. I'll put a link down in the description, because in this video, I'm not going to do any clips. I'm not going to show any verses. I'm not even going to read. I'm going to do the verses from memory, okay? Here's the problem with what Pastor Mike is saying. Let's start first things first. Pastor Mike is approaching this topic after having poisoned the waters. What do I mean by that? Pastor Mike says that this is a battle between gay activists and traditional Christians, basically. People who believe that homosexuality is a sin. And so if you're a gay activist, obviously you want to get the homosexuality out of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. That might be true that gay activists want to do that. But, excuse me, the sages of the Talmud are not gay activists. They're not. So the sages of the Talmud disagree with Mike. They think homosexuality is a sin, okay? But yet, they say Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexuality. Orthodox rabbis, probably not all of them, there's probably an Orthodox rabbi out there or two who doesn't believe that homosexuality is a sin. But the position of Orthodox Judaism is that homosexuality is a sin. Orthodox rabbis agree with Mike Winger. Homosexuality is a sin, yet they agree with me. This has nothing to do with homosexuality. So this is not a battle between progressive Christians trying to run homosexuality out of the Bible. This is a question of what does the text say. Now, Pastor Mike makes the assertion that the people of Sodom don't know these are angels because they're presented as men, which they are. They're called men in the text. In one place they're called angels, but in the other places they're called men. So he makes the argument that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, they don't know, or the people of Sodom specifically, don't know that they're men. Now, in order to make this assertion, we would have to assume that the people who are seeing them are treating them the way that they would treat anybody else that they saw. So, what about Abraham? When these men show up to Abraham, what does he do? He bows to the ground, he calls them Lord, he says, come into my house, I'll refresh you from your journey, right? Does he do that with everyone? Now, the Jewish tradition is that he does do that with everyone, but this is where they get it from. This isn't a thing you see repeatedly in the written Torah. I'm sure they have plenty of stories in the Talmud about it, but this isn't something in the written Torah that you see repeatedly happening. It just isn't. What about Lot? Lot does the exact same thing. They come to the city, Lot's sitting in the gate, he sees them, he runs to them, he bows down, come into my house, let me refresh you from the journey. Calls them his lords. Same thing, right? It appears that both Abraham and Lot know that these are divine beings. What about the people of Sodom? How do they greet them? They gather. All of them gather around the house and say, bring them out so that we can have sex with them. Is this the way Sodom greets every visitor? If it is, you're going to have a big problem when you get to Ezekiel. Why? Because Ezekiel says, these are the sins of Sodom. They were proud. They had prosperous ease. They were wealthy, and they didn't take care of the poor. That's their sins. Nothing in there about forced cohabitation with every single person who visits a city. And notice when God comes down and says to Abraham, the outcry against these people has risen up to me. You would think that in addition to, they didn't give me a bed or food when I was traveling, it might include, and they forced me to do this. But for some reason, it doesn't in Ezekiel. Which leads us to problem number 2. Again, going to Ezekiel, the fact that homosexuality, and I don't want to undersell this, so let me explain this real quick. God comes to Abraham and says they've committed sins. Abraham says, before you judge them, let's consider the righteous. God says, okay, if we find enough righteous, but then he destroys the city anyway. Same thing happens in Ezekiel. God, here are the sins of Sodom. Then I came down and they committed an abomination in front of me, so I destroyed them when I saw it. So the same thing in both places. So these are the sins, according to Ezekiel, these are the sins that got God to come down. Homosexuality is not on the list, which means if we're going to read the abomination as homosexuality, then we have to presume that a city full of heterosexuals all choose the same day to become homosexuals and became such militant homosexuals that they're trying to have forced cohabitation with these 2 men who showed up as visitors. Does that follow logical thought process? It doesn't. But what about the text? Is there anything in the text that would indicate that these are not homosexuals? As it turns out, there is. In Genesis 19, a lot of hay gets made about how often the word man is repeated. So, for example, the verse says from the ESV, and I might misquote it a little bit here, but I'm going to get it basically right. From the ESV, it says the men of the city. All of the men, from young to old, all of the people to the last man, surrounded the house and said, bring them out so that we may know them, which means have sex with them, right? All of the men. All of the men. But the translation's being played with a little bit here, folks. Now, the first 2 men mean men to the exclusion of women. It's not a generic humans, right? It means men. So all of the men, or the men of Sodom, not the women, the men of Sodom, all of the men, not the women, those 2 men's right there, those both mean a man by sex, gender, however you want to classify it, right? Those are men. But it goes on to say all of the people, right? Now, it already told us all of the men, from young to old, all the men. But then it says all the people, right? Does that mean men? No, it does not. The Hebrew word there means either your father's relatives or generically people. And most of the time in the ESV, or most of the time in the ESV, it's translated as people, right? Because that's what it means. It means people, but more specifically, it can mean your father's relatives. But either way, it'd be men and women. Then it says, to the last man. Is that what the text says? No, it doesn't. That word there not only doesn't mean man, it doesn't mean people. It means to the last extremity, which is the way that Young's literal translation translates it. So when we read it that way, what we get is the men of Sodom. All of the men, from young to old. All the people to the last extremity, right? In other words, this isn't just a group of men saying bring them out so that we may know them. This is a co-ed group. There are both men, women, elderly, children. All of the people of Sodom are in this group saying, bring them out so that we may know them. Sounds a little less homosexual now, doesn't it? But what does Lot think? Does Lot think they're homosexuals? Lot says, hey, don't do anything to these men. Take my daughters instead. Is this what you would say to a mob of homosexuals? Let me satisfy you with these beautiful women? They don't like women. They're homosexuals. But remember, we just said there were women out there too. Maybe the women are lesbians, right? Maybe Lot's saying, hey, the women can have these women and maybe that'll satisfy them, right? But is there anything in the text that would indicate that any people in this group who are men are not homosexual? And the answer, once again, is yes. Lot has 2 daughters. Those daughters have fiancés, we would say today. They're called sons-in-laws in the text. So when the angel comes to Lot and he goes, hey, is there anybody other than your family that you want to get out of the city? Lot says, yeah, I got 2 sons-in-laws. They're about to marry my daughters. I want to get them out of there. So the angel says, good, go warn them to get out of here. We're about to blow the place up, right? Lot goes out. They're not in the house. We should have known they're not in the house. Why? Because all of the men of Sodom, all of the men, from young to old, all of them are out there in this mob, including Lot's sons-in-laws, who clearly are not gay because they're engaged to his daughters. You have to shoehorn homosexuality into this text. It's not written there. Now, the translations do their best to cover this up. So what is the abomination in Ezekiel? Ezekiel never tells us. He just tells us that they were very proud and wealthy, and they did not take care of the poor, and then they committed an abomination. That leads us to the book of Jude, and when Pastor Mike gets there, he does something, whether intentionally or not, that is extraordinarily dishonest. He takes you straight to the verse that's about Sodom and Gomorrah, which would make sense since we're talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, but it doesn't make sense because the verse starts out with just as, right? You can't start with a verse that says just as because it's referring back to the previous verse. In order to know what it's just as, I need to know what the previous verse says, right? It says just like the folks of Sodom and Gomorrah pursued unnatural desires and strange flesh in the same manner as the people in the verse before. So whatever Sodom and Gomorrah did, it was just like the people in the verse before, and they did it in the same manner that the people in the verse before did it. Who are the people in the verse before? They're angels. They're not humans. They're angels. So wait a second. You're telling me that the verse he read, which kind of sounded because the ESV translates pursued different flesh or strange flesh, it translates it as unnatural desire, which leaves it open to jimmy it in. It's homosexuality. The way Pastor Mike explains it, he goes, well, it's different flesh as in different from what they're supposed to have relations with, right? Come on. It's strange flesh. It's different flesh. It's alien flesh. It's flesh that's not like theirs, right? Because it's angels. All you have to do is read those two verses together. This verse says that whatever they did is like those people, and that they pursued sexual immorality and chased after strange flesh in the same manner that those people did. And if this is like that, then by definition, that is like this. If this sandwich is like that sandwich, then that sandwich is like this sandwich. Sodom and Gomorrah, whatever they did is just like those angels. So who are those angels? Well, if you go back to Genesis 6, the sons of God come down to the daughters of man. How do I know that that's what Jude is talking about? Well, it's pretty easy. Because if we keep reading in Jude, you're going to come across two verses that talk about ungodly people doing ungodly things in ungodly ways for ungodly purposes with ungodly friends and ungodly, right? Take those verses, highlight them, copy, paste it into your search engine, Google, and it's going to tell you where it came from. And one of the places is going to be Jude, but you already knew that, didn't you? The other place is the book of Enoch. And Jude, as it turns out, attributes this to Enoch. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied and said, right? What is the book of Enoch about, ladies and gentlemen? It's about Genesis 6, when the sons of God came down to the daughters of men. According to the book of Enoch, these sons of God were angels called watchers who came down, and they taught humans all kinds of bad things, and they had sex with the daughters of men, creating the Nephilim, these ancient warriors, men of renown, who lorded it over the people and dominated and just wreaked havoc until God said, I have to destroy the whole earth with a flood, right? Scorched earth policy, everything gone. Not just humans, right? Noah and his family survive on the ark. Every other human on the planet dies. Every animal dies, other than the ones on the ark, right? Every plant dies. Everything. And that is the exact same way that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is described in the text, which is probably why Jude tied these two things together and said, aha, angels came down, people wanted to have sex with them. What does that remind me of? The Genesis flood. Like, it's literally... to argue against this, to try to shoehorn homosexuality into this text, look at the obstacles you have to overcome. Mike Winger literally needs to find an example of angels having homosexual sex in the same manner as Sodom and Gomorrah if he wants to say that that's what Jude is talking about. But what he did instead was left that verse about the angels out. It is perfectly clear that Jude is talking about the angels from the book of Enoch. And why do I say that? Because he tells you what their judgment is. They are bound in chains until the day of judgment. And ladies and gentlemen, this same author already quoted the book of Enoch and attributed it to Enoch. And where do we first read that the angels are bound in chains until the day of judgment? Spoiler alert, it ain't 2 Peter. It's the book of Enoch. This is absolutely what Jude is talking about. Now, Pastor Mike, I love you, man. I do. I really like you. I don't do any of this with any hostility whatsoever. You're just wrong about this. You're taking your definition and shoehorning it into the text. That's not thinking biblically. That's thinking like the church, but it's not thinking biblically. To think biblically is to read the text and to pull the meaning out of the text, not to push your meaning into it. And like you said, if you don't agree with Jude, that's fine. If you say, you know what, Steve, you convinced me, that's what Jude is saying, but I disagree with him, I can shake your hand on that. But when you sit there and try to force your reading into the book of Jude when it's clearly not what he's saying, I beg of you, if you watch this video, and I'm hoping you do, I'm going to post it in the comments over there. Please, I implore you, go back and read the text again and see if you come to the same conclusion. See the ties between Jude and 1st Enoch. And I would like to point out that you go on to do the same thing with Leviticus 18. You take a couple of verses out of their context and then misrepresent that these are for all the world and not just the nation of Israel. I'm going to address that in a future video. If you want to be notified when that video comes up, then just subscribe to the channel, click the alert button, and you'll get that notification. But if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel, and whatever you do, don't just sit there, do something. And remember, I'm going to have a link to my full video on Sodom and Gomorrah in the comments down below. So if you want my full breakdown on it, but that's specific to James White's sermon. This one, specific to Pastor Mike Winger. Pastor Mike, I love you. Hope you watch it. Reconsider your views.